Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today.
Should I do the limbo?
I think I know most people in the room, but I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to the Government Affairs Forum featuring United States Congressman Richard Neal. We're thrilled to be here with all of you, but especially Congressman Neal, a longtime friend, a longtime supporter of not only our chamber, of course, but our friends out in the Western Mass Economic Development Council and other chambers throughout the Commonwealth. The chamber continues to convene policymakers, business leaders, and community members through this series. With the Government Affairs Forum, we highlight political leaders at the federal, state, and local levels, and today's conversation with Congressman Neal, as I'm sure you all appreciate, is an especially timely one. You all know the recent government shutdown was the longest in history, impacting people in every state and city, and I'm sure that Congressman Neal will have some things to say about that. I want to take a few minutes to highlight some upcoming chamber events. On November 18th, we'll co-host an event with our friends at the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation that will focus on a very good report that they just released. It's on their website. It's a competitiveness index that talks about the metrics that we can use as a Commonwealth to gauge our competitiveness as a state. So we're partnering with the Taxpayers Foundation to put an event together on that issue on November 19th. On November 20th, we're hosting a Transportation First event featuring Senator Brendan Clayton and Representative James Asiero. It'll be moderated by Karen Ryan, Managing Director at State Street, and we'll hear from the leadership in our state on transportation issues, what's on their minds and what we can expect during this session. On December 19th, we'll host our final Government Affairs Forum of the year featuring Massachusetts Treasurer Deb Goldberg, so I hope you'll take a look at bostonchamber.com, register for these events, and see what else we have on the agenda. We're almost ready to welcome Congressman Neal, but before I do, a couple of acknowledgments. Please join me in thanking Chamber Executive Committee Paul A. Rugnata, who's been your host today. Paul, where are you? And a big thank you to our longtime sponsor of our Government Affairs Forum, Bank of America, who also was the host of yesterday's chamber event, which was our Principal Partners event, in which 71 members of the business community shadowed a Boston Public School principal for the day. Bank of America then hosted a lunch of all the people that participated in that. A really terrific and inspiring event, getting to see what the job of principal of a major urban school system is like. And I know we all came away appreciating the work that they do. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to my friend Maurice Coleman, who is Tax Credit Syndication and Investment Executive at Bank of America, who will introduce Congressman Neal. Maurice?
Good afternoon. Oh, we can do that. Let's try that again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We are going to have a good time this afternoon. First and foremost, can we give Jim and the Greater Boston Chamber team a round of applause for all their hard work? They're proud to be a sponsor. I don't want this microphone to fall. So first and foremost, Congressman Neal, I personally want to thank you for all your support and your leadership. So my title is National Tax Credit Syndication and Investment Executive. That means that I get a chance to help to finance innovative and vibrant communities by using tax credits. Can't thank you enough. In a city that you know well, Worcester, we were able to provide $85 million in debt and equity financing to redevelop the Curtis Apartments, 129 units, phase 1. And we're creating affordable housing for people who are making 30% of AMI up to 80% of AMI, so teachers, fire department workers, police officers can live, work, play, and grow in their community. Again, we can do that. It's always a pleasure to be with the Chamber and to serve in part as your host. It's an honor to introduce Congressman Neal. Congressman Neal has been a leading voice, as I think we all know, at both the state and the national level, supporting all the work that we do in our communities through his wealth of knowledge and expertise in making sure that our country and all the residents of Massachusetts have a better quality of life. Congressman Neal was elected to the House of Representatives in 1988. When he was elected, he served his first 2 terms in office on the House Banking Committee. Before joining the Ways and Means Committee of Congress in 1993, where he has worked tirelessly on behalf of all of us and Americans throughout the country. In 2019, it was no surprise that Congressman Neal was elected by his peers to be the chairman of the House of Ways and Means Committee. This was the first time since 1875 that a representative from the Bay State had achieved that milestone. That deserves a huge round of applause. In 2020, when our country was hit the hardest by COVID-19, it was our Congressman Neal, who stood up and provided over $1 billion to the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan to make sure that Americans got the relief and care that they needed. You see, Congressman Neal is no stranger to standing up in crisis. Therefore, he's received countless accolades and awards for his work, but some of the things that I love about his resume is that while he plays at a national level, he still operates with a local touch. He's still a guest lecturer at UMass Amherst. He also was the ex-mayor of the city of Springfield. And what I like really about his resume, as was mentioned earlier with our program we ran yesterday with the Chamber, he is an ex-high school teacher, as am I. That is phenomenal. And we can't thank you enough for being a congressman of people and of communities. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me introduce to you our Congressman, Richard Neal.
Thanks, Bush, very much for those nice remarks. And it's always a prestigious opportunity to speak to the Boston Chamber of Commerce. So I want to thank Jim Rooney for the great job that he's done. A lot of the folks who I look at out here in the audience, I go way back with them. I always tickle some of the folks that I started with because I always say we all started getting elected together, and I stayed with it. But the forum that you provide obviously has great influence on not only regional events, but Boston clearly helps to set the tone for much of what happens across New England and indeed the Northeast. And Jim in particular, he's been a good source of counsel over many of these years. And when Morris was introducing me, he was talking about the Ways and Means Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee is the only committee that's mentioned in our Constitution. And it implies, as the term does, responsibility for the ways and means of raising the revenue to administer the government. And there's never a clean, easy, neat way to raise the revenue. Generally, people can agree on what somebody else should pay in tax. Less so when it comes to their own endeavors. But we do have responsibility for all tax matters, as the Constitution suggests. I was at the Supreme Court, which I already mentioned in a few moments. I was at the Supreme Court last week. I filed a brief in front of the court challenging the president's authorities as it relates to tariffs, which I know is a big issue here in Boston as I look out. The airport, the seaport here, they're very important. I believe that the economy in Massachusetts is almost 1/3 trade related, and we derive a direct benefit on that basis. So at the Supreme Court, I found myself cheering for Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch. They asked the very questions that were in my brief, so we're going to await that outcome as well. But trade, tariffs, Social Security, Medicare, the tax side of Medicaid, pensions, welfare, and management of the public debt. And it's a very small working committee because we tend to look for members of the committee that have certainly advocacy, but not the idea that every position that comes before you is one that can be either embraced or dismissed easily. They tend to be pretty complicated matters because the tax world is arcane. Particularly in Washington, I saw had a chance to greet some folks that did some tax work, I believe, over here at Liberty Mutual. I said, you should thank us, we keep you busy. Because you're late at night, some evenings, you're doing the tax work, and somebody says, well, here's this, or here's that. And you say, okay, let's try that. And then you find out a few days later, maybe what you tried wasn't quite what you thought as the prescription offered. I had a very funny moment that I always talk about, because I've been much indebted to the lore of the Congress. I'm a fan of congressional history, a believer in the institutions of Congress, representative democracy, which we're about to celebrate the birthing of in but a few months, beginning with Ken Burns this Sunday night for 6 sessions of 2 hours each to talk about the role that this city played in building eventually a constitutional system that became, in so many ways, the envy of the world. And the Declaration of Independence that Mr. Jefferson prescribed at 33 years old, when he wrote that document, it changed the whole world forever. Just those words in the course of human events, and they end with, to this we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And I know that a lot of people are going to bicker about this because democracy is noisy. But I also think that when you look at the revolutions that took place everywhere because of it, where average people stood up, people that had legitimate grievances about what had happened, they nonetheless used the Declaration as their source of inspiration. But the work that we do with the Ways and Means Committee, because it has such broad responsibilities. I was in Belfast with Speaker Pelosi, and a woman, as you know, of some determination, and we were making small talk, and I got along with her very, very well. She never once challenged me when I suggested to her we should try this or that in the tax world. And we were waiting to go on stage, and she was talking about the Ways and Means Committee, and she looked at me and she said, you know, Richie, she said, there are a lot of people that think the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is more important than the Speaker of the House. To which I looked at her and said, I'm not one. We'll be very clear about that, believe me. But again, back to the business at hand, I hope that nobody's happy about what we've experienced for the last 40+ days. And it was an unfortunate outcome, but there are principles. And the principles include the idea that many of us don't want to see the American healthcare system decimated. And in this city alone, and I'm going to get to the specifics of it later on, the governor I know wanted to hear what I had to say. This takes me to a funny moment because I'm going to use it because I was a fan of Bill Weld.
Both ways.
Yes. In redistricting, Bill Weld said to me, we were in Westfield together at a breakfast, and he said, look, he said, in redistricting, I'm trying to help you. And I said, thank you. And he said, it's not on purpose. I think there's 2 we can take out, and you're not one of them. I said, good work. So, but back to that point, the healthcare system, those tax credits are really important. 24 million Americans run the risk of losing those tax credits by December 31st. And we thought that digging in on that principle was worth it, which takes us to the broader context of what healthcare means to this city and what it means to this state. Medicare and Medicaid are the biggest employers in the state. These hospitals, which are really going to get clipped next year, they are amongst, if not the best in the world. I often say with some boosterism, if you have a sick child, you're coming to Boston. This didn't just happen. It happened because of our universities and our colleges, all of those things. So NIH is being cut, the Centers for Disease Control are being cut, and every one of these hospitals in Boston, like the ones that I have in Springfield, Holyoke, Pittsfield, North Adams, all of these hospitals are at least 50% dependent on Medicare, and if you add in the 15 to 20% more, Medicaid. So there are private pays which set aside the reputation, particularly in a place like Boston, more so than much of the rest of the state. But where would Worcester be without UMass Memorial? Springfield, those hospitals, the Sisters of Providence, Bay State Medical Center. I'm very proud of the fact, as we've talked about hospital consolidation, I opened a hospital, reopened one in North Adams, Massachusetts, because that's how important it is. People identify their hospital much as they identify a library, the town space. They identify with that hospital because it provides them with a great sense of security. So when I look at these cuts that are being proposed, they're mindless. I was part of the development of the ACA, and it was, again, born here in Massachusetts. We all gave up something to get it done. But the idea of the Affordable Care Act was universal access. The private sector was kept alive to discipline price, but the idea was to incrementally build year after year more subscribers to the healthcare system for the purpose of basic economics spreading risk and managing that risk. So here's something that I think we should be mindful of that we frequently don't pay a lot of attention to, and that's the following. Every child in Massachusetts has health insurance. That's an applause line. I mean, that's how 97% of the adults in Massachusetts have health insurance. That was the idea. Now, in the aftermath of the pandemic, which I'm really proud of the work that the Ways and Means Committee did during the pandemic, yes, we did enhance the tax credits. And the idea was to get us to the other side of the pandemic, to get more people to subscribe. So if they want to have a separate argument about income guidelines down the road, we can have a separate argument about that, or a discussion. But let's provide an opportunity to extend those tax credits, and then we'll have that discussion. 1 year doesn't do it because it gets us past the election. And the problem with just getting past the election is you revisit it again after the election. So I'm hopeful that some of us who really do want to see an adequate outcome, that we'll find a path forward coming to the end of this legislative session into the beginning of next year. We've got a window here to find some agreement. And a note of irony, where do these tax credits play out the most? In the red states, by far. By far. It's one of the ironies of this argument. There are 8 states that did not adopt the Affordable Care Act, and we think that there were certain enticements. Republican governors, like my friend John Kasich, they took the credits. They enhanced expansion, particularly of the CHIPS Act for children, and expanding and spreading healthcare opportunities, but using universal access as the principle. So when we look at the debate, I know people are upset. I had more advice on the plane on the way up today than I've had in a long time. One of the things about some visibility on this, it does increase name recognition. And we discussed it, the flight attendants discussed it with me, people there sitting next to me, they discussed it. A fellow sitting next to me, he discussed it, he said, I'm thinking of moving to your district. I said, I'll show you the houses. And I call attention to that because when you try to take away a benefit, that's when people get upset. They might not like the introduction of the benefit, but always remember this, Social Security was a compromise. Medicare was a compromise. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Medicare Act in 1965, it was a compromise. Medicaid, because it was perceived as a benefit for the poor, didn't have quite the same constituency that Medicare had because people felt, well, I've always paid into Medicare. So here's a statistic for all of us in Massachusetts. 52 cents on the Medicaid dollar now goes to long-term care. Who here can take care of an aging parent? As we celebrate people living longer, there's another attending reality, and the reality is more dementia. More long-term care is going to be necessary. And I think that we ought to be able to coalesce around these principles based upon the outline that I offered a moment ago, universal access, and we can bicker about cost as we do it. And there are adequate restraints. Let me go to the tariff issue. The argument that we have offered in opposition to these tariffs is the basic understanding that tariffs are a tax. Now, I do not oppose the idea of the threat of using tariffs or a targeted tariff. But I don't think that we can embrace tariffs on the basis of who we like and dislike that day. So there's a negative ad that's run using Ronald Reagan's truthful description of tariffs, and we decide to shut down negotiations with Canada. I've never met anybody who was mad at Canada about anything. And couple that with the following that I think is essential as well. The Massachusetts economy is heavily dependent upon Canadian trade. When you look at the statistics, as Jim's nodding his head, it's pretty overwhelming. Really overwhelming as to how important that relationship is in terms of trade. And Governor Baker, Quebec Hydro, I mean, it depends on a good working relationship that we established during those years. But sitting at the Supreme Court the other day, in the brief that we filed in opposition to the President's tariffs, it also goes to another very important principle right now in America. Congress has the responsibility to tax. That is suggested in Article 1 of our Constitution. Presidents don't get to impose taxes on people they like or dislike. So in Canada, or then it's Brazil. We don't like the outcome of a presidential election in Brazil, so we're going to have 50% tariffs. Tariffs have to be used gingerly. Tariffs that are being applied to our NATO allies and friends, the way that this is being done only drives them away. Argentina with a currency swap of $40 billion because we happen to like the outcome of that election. That is not the way you structure tariffs. I've done this for a long time. And I was the lead negotiator on USMCA. I know some chamber officials are here. I negotiated that with the administration. And let me say, the Republican, Bob Lighthizer, he did a terrific job at the time. And I call attention to that because I'm going to give you a couple of statistics. 195 Democrats voted for that trade agreement, and 194 Republicans voted for that trade agreement. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed the trade agreement. The AFL-CIO and the Teamsters endorsed the trade agreement. That's bipartisanship. And now we're trying to talk about undoing USMCA. Mexico's our largest trading partner in the world, and Canada's a close second. So I argue that the tariffs in front of the court last week, the questions that were asked by Justice Gorsuch, Justice Barrett, and what are described as the three more liberal justices, I think might indicate that it could be 5-4 or 6-3. Chief Justice Roberts, he asked a series of attendant questions well that meant to me that he really understood the issue. The court will not decide the tariff issue based on economics. They're going to decide it on law, and that's what we want. That's what we want. So you look at the tariff issue, you look at the health care issue, and you look at the expiring resolution that we voted on last night in January, we've got to find some stability in this system now. The chaotic nature of what we do and what is being offered, it makes it hard when you walk out of the room after you've been discussing a very complicated tax matter with the tax cult in Washington, and that's what they are, it's a cult. We get excited by going home to watch the Pats tonight, they get excited by taking home the tax code tonight. But when you look at these tax matters, you deliberate, you go on for weeks, as we did with USMCA, months. And then you walk out of the room now, and a reporter says, do you think Roger Clemens ought to be in the Hall of Fame? It's the constant distractions that we find trying to go forward. I look at this, and I also look at what happened last week in New Jersey. I talked to Governor-elect Cheryl yesterday. She's terrific. She is really a good person. Very moderate in tone, moderate in her politics, and Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. They were expected to win, but Cheryl's margin was supposed to be 3, it was 13. Spanberger was expected to win, her margin was supposed to be 10, it was 15.5. And whatever we think of what happened in California with redistricting, that started out, Newsom could have lost that. He won it by 2-1. And back to the issue with the governor here, as we talked about redistricting, pros do redistricting in Massachusetts, but we all adhere to the principle it ought to be done only every 10 years, for good reason, to take some of the heat out of the system. And now we run the risk of this coming up every 2 years after an election, or every 4 years after a gubernatorial election. That does not mean stability for the system. I look at, and I know Jim's going to ask me a couple of questions about the big, beautiful, alleged bill. The problem with that legislation, and I'll speak to it specifically, is whatever your politics are here, you can't deny the fact that 70% of those benefits are going to go to people at the top. People that make under $50,000 a year, they're getting about $1 a day. Now this is from the tax world. They do these numbers, the Joint Committee on Taxation. So all of a sudden the idea becomes if we don't like the statistical data, then we fire the people that provide it. If you meet the people at the Joint Committee on Taxation, These are some of the finest people you'd ever want to meet. I have no idea if they're Democrats or Republicans, libertarians or socialists. They just hand you the facts. This is what's going to happen, as most good tax lawyers will say to elected officials. They don't say you should do this or you should do that. They'll say, this is what's going to happen if you do this or you do that. And I got to tell you, overwhelmingly, they're right. And Tom Barthol, who was the head of the Joint Committee on Taxation, when he speaks in front of the Ways and Means Committee, you want to go out and check his pulse. He's so careful with his word choice because they know what they say can really distort markets immediately. When I took the job as chairman of the committee, Janice Mays, who had worked with Mr. Rostenkowski, who was the chairman of the committee when I joined her, that gives you a timeline, by the way. She said to me, not congratulations the day that I became chairman, she said, I just want to say something to you. She was the head of the staff. She said, I just want to say something to you, Mr. Chairman. There are a handful of jobs in this town that will change markets. You now have one of them. Very circumspect in my comments. Very, very careful. Not to suggest this or that after it has not been proved to be authentic and vetted and carefully decided. So it's a very different political world than the one I signed up to, including Congress. In Congress at one time you had Northeastern Republicans and you had Southern Democrats. And now the great challenges are what comes about because of the primary system. And I think that the other lesson, and when Jim's ready, I'm ready as well. One of the real challenges now is because of choose-a-side journalism, the cable shows, and the endless round of social media. The political reward too often has become not to do things because you're rewarded back home for not doing it by the hardest of the believers. And the problem with that is, in a nation that is so divided, literally 50-50, that trying to advance many of these issues for the American people become increasingly difficult. And the last word on that, because I've seen this play out. More and more of the people that get elected to Congress got elected by running against Congress. So the incentive became not to get big things done. So you need the patience of Job in many of these moments to stay with it. I do subscribe to the notion that I learned from that generation, Mr. Rostenkowski and others, an endless patience of listening. When Bob Lighthizer used to call me during the negotiations over USMCA, because he's in a room with all these Democrats who you'd have to go through metal detectors when you talk to them about trade. And he would say to me at night, how much longer are you going to keep torturing me? And I said, see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, because we're going to stay with it until we get this done. And that's how I think that you do it. But the problem with social media is it amplifies conflict. Immediately. It's right in front of us. And it's the blasts that come to you. And I think oftentimes, if I could just say to some of my younger staffers, well, let me just put down the phone for a second. And let's try to talk to each other. So I'm lamenting the state that we find ourselves in. I don't think that there's going to be a lot of clarity in the coming months. But there are still some things that we have to get done. And we should try very, very hard to get them done. Massachusetts has an extraordinary political history, but also in terms of policy. So whenever I have a Boston audience, I always say to the Boston audience, I hope there's nobody in the city of Boston who would ever complain about infrastructure spending. Tim knew just what he was doing with the big dig. He put the $5 billion in and retired. And they were digging ever since. But look what that big dig has done, and Bill Weld was a very important partner on that, was Paul Salucci. Look what the big dig did for this city. It transformed this city. Everywhere you go. Look what it did for the very area that we're in. And it was that federal expenditure. So I'm really proud of the fact that during my time as chairman, we did the tax side of the infrastructure bill. Right? CHIPS Act. Local 25 out there in Southie. The Woods-Lewis Act. Took care of those pensions. We did, going back to the CARES Act and the American Rescue Package. Everybody got a paycheck during the American Rescue Package. We kept the lights on everywhere. And Steve Mnuchin was a very important part of it. Speaker Pelosi and I negotiated with him for 8 days and got that legislation out the door. 8 days with the rescue package. And when I hear people saying, well, it was inflationary. Inflation was a worldwide problem. It was not just an American problem. And look how fast the American economy responded and rebounded. 4.3% unemployment rate today, but there's still a stubborn part of inflation. And let me be also mindful of this. I think Chairman Powell's done a very good job as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, because he has not succumbed to the pressures of being told what to do about interest rates. I think that you need that independence. If it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or it's the Joint Committee on Taxation, or it's the Federal Reserve Board. You need people who are independently minded to tell you what the facts are in those cases. And I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on a very parochial issue. Infrastructure includes east-west rail. Or as Vinnie Patelli would always say to me, west-east rail. But Governor Healy's been terrific on it, Governor Baker was terrific on it, and Governor Patrick was terrific on the whole notion of east-west rail. There's more than enough money here in the state to do east-west rail. Look what that Tufts Veterinary School did for the city of Worcester because of that rail stop that they have. We want to continue it, and the governor's been wonderful on making sure that additional money has been put in place. We look forward to the construction continuing along the way, but it's a good story, and infrastructure spending indeed does help greater efficiencies in the economy. So when you're ready, Jim.
Okay, while we're getting settled here, please join me in welcoming Governor Bill Welch. Congressman, you mentioned the Central Artery Project funding, the transformation that it's had here in Boston, really affecting more of the Northeast than that. There's a few people in the room that helped spend that money that you and others were helpful in providing for us. A couple of years ago, you and I co-authored a piece on West-East Rail. We were back and forth on the draft of the piece, and I kept sending it back with East-West, and he kept sending it back with West-East. But we got it done. More recently, we've heard of some loss of funding of transportation. We've got some big projects related to the West-East Rail over at Boston Landing. We've got the Cape Cod bridges. What do you see happening with those?
Well,
it should be a nice.
Yeah, but it's.
I think that there is.
It should be on.
Flip it up.
I think there's going to be some anguish for a while, but I think these court cases are going to tell a different story. That money has been appropriated, and it's to be expended. And it takes me to another point, Jim, and that is the fundamental responsibility of congressional life is, when I went to Congress, Jim Wright was the Speaker of the House. Tip had just left. And Speaker Wright greeted the freshman class, and he said, quoting Speaker Rayburn, he said, Speaker Rayburn was asked how many presidents he had served under. And he said, none. I served with 7. And that's the answer. And members of the other side, the Republican Party, they've got to stand up on these issues. They're having their own project flipped. I just would say, in terms of a political error, the decision to cancel New York, New Jersey tunnel probably added 5 points to Mikey Sherrill's victory in New Jersey. I mean, if you have something that's going to happen in the last 6 or 7 days of a campaign, that's something you want. If you're where she was, I don't understand this at all. There are wind projects. The Ways and Means Committee rewrote the tax side of the Inflation Reduction Act, $412 billion worth of tax credits. In the tax world, just one of the things that's interesting about tax credits, and they're staring at me over there. Tax credits are efficient, but they do gum up the tax system. They make it more complicated. But you know what? In terms of the fossil fuel industry, they were taking advantage of those tax credits to wean themselves away from fossil fuels to the renewables. And I thought that it was a reasonable path to use the tax system for that very purpose. So we're back to that standstill, and I don't understand the economics of canceling the project off of Rhode Island. It's 80% done. The economics of it, never mind the other side, it's poorly disguised.
You alluded to the shutdown, last 40 days or so, longest in history. You talked about that issue that, that you and others were standing on, but take us inside the dynamics of what was happening in Washington in terms of discussions to try to get a breakthrough, or how were people treating this, your colleagues?
Well, I think that the fact that people were away from Washington, I went in every day, and so bad, I was on the plane one day and a family said to me, geez, we got a tour. You know how big that is for a family? We got tours scheduled and all of that, and we can't. I said, here at 11 o'clock, I'll do the tour tomorrow. We'll just cruise. But I think that if you could get members in the elevator to have the same conversation on the floor, you can do the breakthrough, because that's more personal. But I thought that on our side, the tax credits were really important. We see the ACA as the expansion of Roosevelt's beliefs and Johnson's beliefs. That the American people need health care. And universal access was what it was all about. We thought the tax credits were that important. I think that now the dynamic shifts. Tax credits are front and center. Shutdown's over. Now they've got to figure out on the other side what the accommodation will be, and there has to be an accommodation. Because as I said earlier, the red states really get clobbered.
I know this is hypothetical, but it ended with the 8 senators, who decided to make a deal. But the hypothetical is, play it out. If they didn't, where would you see this going? We've got, and I want to come back to some of the implications. We were dealing with SNAP. We were dealing with, the flight delays that you experienced today. It was starting to affect more people. Where would it have gone if the stalemate continued and that breakthrough didn't happen?
Well, I've stayed away from the intramural argument on our own side. The House numbers stayed pretty strong, and I'll leave it to the senators to point out why they reached the conclusion they did. The Senate operates very differently than the House because of the 6-year term versus the 2-year term. The 2-year term is more, it was designed for the purpose of emotion, popular will, getting to the issue at hand. The Senate with a 6-year term, it's more about deliberation, kind of an endless round from time to time of those deliberations. And I also think that the other problem is in the Senate that, despite what they say, none of them really want to give up the filibuster. Wise people will say, I'm going to be on the other side of that someday.
So the SNAP payments, we've got, I know we're all busy, but the busiest person in the room, Lindy Downey, is here from the Boston Food Bank. Please thank Lindy and the Food Bank. People really, in desperate situations. How is that playing out in the conversations that, people were literally losing food?
So the Springfield Republican, on Sunday, they ran a fascinating piece that got my attention, which I commented on Monday when I do the New England Public Radio interviews that I do weekly. And it outlined where SNAP benefits actually go. I was stunned. And Long Meadow, East Long Meadow, Wilbraham, those are high-income communities. And people overwhelmingly who receive SNAP benefits go to work. Because this is a chamber-type audience, I think that it also bears noting that there's a series of complications now in our labor participation rates. And the complications come from the fact that there's more downward pressure on wages than there has been in a long period of time. And it's not enough just to say it's the rich want to get richer, poor don't want to do this or that. That's not the case. The reality is that it's about skills. You need fewer people to do much of this work, and AI is taking us down this road a lot faster. It's about globalization. It's changed the contours of where things can be made in terms of price. And the other issues here are you can do trade just about any place. And that's pushed down wages. Right now, you can see labor markets beginning to soften. And I think that that's occurring. And I think that this whole idea, when you look at some of these towns, now Springfield has a significant number of people. 47% or 48% receive a SNAP. And Holyoke, Chicopee as well. Very, very high number. Somebody mentioned to me that in the room, I don't want to be quoted out again, but Methuen, they said, had a large number of SNAP recipients. 90% of the people on SNAP, it's entirely legitimate. And this idea that it's all illegals that are taking SNAP, it's not true. It's just not true. It's like the idea that 300-year-olds were getting Social Security. I mean, I listened to this and startled by it. So again, if you have a chance to call up, there's a pretty remarkable piece that was done about who really gets SNAP benefits in the Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts.
One last question on the shutdown. You, as more than anyone in the room, probably understand the ability to move money around and pay the military or fund SNAP or not. You know, to us, that's confusing about what the rules are. Talk a little bit about that, the ability during a moment like this to move money around.
Well, we presidents have enormous latitude. And that can be for things that you desire or things that are not so desirable. But I thought that you could see the political implications of some of the decisions that were being made based on who was getting paid. And what was more popular perhaps than what some thought others were entitled to. But you know, the TSA employees, they should have been paid. They were working. People at the airlines, they should have been paid. And I think that it's about security for sure, but it's people that came to work every day. You know, the restaurateurs in the Longworth building, they came to work every day. They should get paid. And I think that the outcome was, when you go into the room and you have these deliberations, it's pretty complicated. But you want people to go to work, they certainly should have been paid. 700,000 people, I think, were furloughed. And that's a consequence that was not desirable.
Shifting gears, you mentioned research funding. You and I have worked on research funding together for a while, and thank you for all of the support over a long time to NIH funding, national science funding. You know, we're in a different moment now. We've formed a coalition of 85 chambers in 35 states, red, blue. We did a fly-in not too long ago. You know, what's going on there, and what can we do? What advice would you give to the recipient communities, the states like Massachusetts, but even Mississippi that gets a lot of defense and scientific funding, and other states that really depend on it? What's the game that is going on that we need to be more cognizant of?
Well, in NIH, I mean, Massachusetts is the 14th largest state. We're the second largest recipient of NIH dollars. And look, if you're going to find cures for these awful dreaded diseases, a lot of it's going to take place right here in Massachusetts and the city of Boston. I mean, these educational institutions, coupled with the doctors that are attracted here, and they tend to stay after they graduate from these institutions. So I think that the whole research funding issue, you know, look, we all want a very healthy and thriving private sector. But the internet was invented at DARPA, a defense agency. The amount of money in the defense budget at one time for breast cancer research was wild. People knew how to access it. And I think that that's part of this argument. But this Kindle Square This used to annoy Nancy Pelosi when I used to say this. Kendall Square has the highest concentration of R&D in the world. She used to stare at me because she wanted me to think it was Silicon Valley. But in terms of just the area, who would want that in terms of the constellation of growth and opportunity? We have it here, nurturing it, building it, and investing in it. And I don't think there was a lot of thought that went into these cuts, to be frank. I just thought that all of a sudden, it's an arbitrary number. You know, it's like Doge, we're gonna cut $2 trillion. It didn't cut $200 billion and left town.
You know, one of the things we've learned in our advocacy around research funding is some of the arguments that seem to resonate are that every state gets some form of research funding. Doesn't matter what congressional district you're in. And there seemed to be a uniting factor in our national competitiveness. Have we lost that somehow?
I don't think we've lost it. I think that the controversies that are now surrounding our educational institutions, they are being targeted. And I think that's part of this, it's a political argument. But let me give you sort of another ancillary issue that a lot of people don't really, I think, understand. So within Medicare, it's called Graduate Medical Education, GME. That's how we train our doctors. And there's not a city in America that does better than Boston in GME and training doctors here. And they're world-class doctors. And I think that those are parts of the budgeting process that a lot of people might not see because they tend to get brought up about the surface issues. But I do take some delight, you should know, in saying to doctors, well, you know, of course, that Medicare subsidized your education. And I await the response. Because that's part of the constellation that I referenced earlier. That's how important it is to our state.
What, you mentioned the, what is it, OB3, I guess some people call it, and you can fill in.
We call it a lot of things.
Yeah, you can fill in what B you want to sort of. what
Okay,
word
so
you wanna
let me
use,
give you
but-
a tutorial on this because it's going to be based upon facts. So when Bill Clinton left on January 19th, 2001, we were staring at enormous surpluses and 4 balanced budgets. 2 massive tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, $1.3 trillion in 2001, another $1 trillion in 2003, right? War in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, and the collapse of Wall Street in 2008. These are facts. 2017, our colleagues on the other side decided to borrow $2.3 trillion for a tax cut. Borrowing money for a tax cut. It's like the idea that we're going to give you $2,000 now because of the tariffs. The numbers just don't add up. In the latest round of the big bill, $4 trillion of borrowed money for a tax cut. The numbers just don't make any sense. And I look at this and I look back at the probity that Republicans once had about fiscal responsibility. They used to lecture us widely and roundly on it. And now, this idea that you can borrow money for tax cuts and really not have the sort of growth that we're told can happen. I mean, if you look back at Clinton's growth rates, wow, 22 million jobs, 4 balanced budgets, and a radical decline in SNAP benefits because if you're working, you don't need SNAP benefits at the time. And I think that, I know I sound as though it's dated information, but it's accurate information.
Yeah. You mentioned that SJC case, the tariffs. You know, in terms of the decision they can make, one report I read said that they could potentially ask for the tariffs to be paid back.
Yes?
But they have some latitude, of course, to the SJC. What are the options?
Well, I mean, if they demand that the money is paid back, I'm not sure how many businesses are going to pass that back to the consumers or it's been collected. There's a certain reality there. The other thing that they can do, and I think Chief Justice Roberts, he has steered a lot of these contentious issues, as you know, in terms of trying to find some consensus. But I also think that they can say that going forward, you can't collect that would be a way to get past this touchy issue
Yeah.
of what to do. But, you know, just to sit there in our system of democracy, you know, and I had a great seat.
Yeah.
I've had some experience with the court before, in a major case, we prevailed. But just to sit there and hear the questioning back and forth, I thought I could have written those questions.
Yeah.
Not based upon the fact that I should be on the Supreme Court, but based upon the fact that I understand the basic issues of who is responsible for tax. And it is not this president or the other president.
Next year, big year with the midterms.
Yeah.
A lot of redistricting going on around the country, as you alluded to. What do you expect to happen?
Well, at the moment, it looks more and more like it's a wash. I know that when the governor, I'm sorry, when the president, once again, kind of in a impetuous manner, said he didn't say to Texas, I want you to do redistricting, he said, I want you to get me 5 more seats. I want you to get me 5 more seats. Well, all of a sudden, Governor Newsom took a long chance. And it looks as though maybe 5 to 7 in California now. And then if you look at the Utah case yesterday, 2 days ago, that would lean Democratic. But in Indiana, Kansas has rejected the idea at the moment. And I thought it was clever by the member of Congress who's a Democrat, Sharice David from Kansas. She's a Native American woman, and she wins against long odds out there. Last time around, she won by 14 points. So when they said they were going to redistrict her seat, she said, that's great, I'll run for the Senate. And the Republicans in the Senate said, not a good idea. So maybe we should do redistricting. And so I've been talking to some of the members. I was with Vicente Gonzalez last night, and he has a challenge from the left as well. He's a mainstream Democrat. But he's an example of this redistricting plot. I think in Texas, we likely win 2 or 3 of the 5 seats anyway. I think these are long-term loyalties in Congress. It's very hard to undo that. I also think Governor Hochul is going to be under some pressure to do something. So I just don't think that for the sake of democracy, the precedent that the president has established is a good idea. I think you need a period of 10 years, and then let's see where population flows go, which the framers intended.
I shared with you before we came on that I had the opportunity to have lunch with another group of chamber presidents with Kevin Brady from Texas, who I think preceded and succeeded you.
Preceded.
Preceded. I thought he did both. But anyway.
He wanted to.
Republican chairman of Ways and Means. But, you know, he, as we were going around the table introducing ourselves, and I said I was from Massachusetts, I mean, he had glowing comments to say about you and the relationship and your ability to work together. He made mention of you and co-sponsoring the Secure Act of 2019 in particular that made some important changes to retirement plans. Talk about the ability to work with someone like you and him seem to work, I mean, from what he had reported, work together well, despite the fact that, well, he was in, you were out, he was out, you were in.
And a really good guy.
Yeah.
Most importantly, a really good guy. And
versus maybe today. I mean,
Kevin Brady's a very conservative guy.
yeah.
But one of the things that I admired much about him, he was a Chamber of Commerce Republican.
Probably why you had lunch with me.
But he was of that ilk. He wanted an outcome, and the point that he makes, as I highlighted earlier, in USMCA, he was even impressed with what we pulled off. And on Secure and Secure 2.0, on the retirement front, it's a big deal what we were able to get done. He voted for it, and he was helpful. The other part of it I thought that was important, it's a small thing, but I'm dating myself again. But I used to get together with him every 2 weeks. We used to do home and away in his office or my office, so that we wouldn't surprise each other. And I understood the theatrics of what you have to say from time to time. Because he had to get elected in Texas. He was from South Dakota, by the way, which he never wanted me to tell anybody. But he had a very good demeanor, very good sense of humor. And when we were doing closure on their tax bill in 2017, he knew I was dead set against it. I thought it was bad policy. So the last morning, we had met regularly, I said, Kevin, come on. And I had 3 issues that I was really worked up about, beyond the fact who was gonna get the tax cut. They were gonna eliminate the historic tax credit, the low-income housing tax credit, and new markets tax credits. They were gonna eliminate them.
That's my world.
Yeah. And I said to him at that final meeting, I said, come on, you're not gonna eliminate those. He said, Richard, we have to. I said, no, you don't have to. So then I used, this is again, it's a good opportunity for people to examine sometimes how this takes place, but I had to get it on the record in public. See, I had to move the argument to the public record. It wasn't enough for the 2 of us to have a disagreement in a room over breakfast. And so I said to him, I said to the chairman of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to Tom Bartholomew, I said, Mr. Bartholomew, knowing the answer to the question is not a bad thing sometimes in politics, you have to get it out there. You know, and you don't want some surprises either in these moments. So I said, what did our Republican colleague do with those 3 tax credits? Because I knew, by the way, the low-income housing tax credit is very popular on the Republican side. It's home builders use it. It's a big deal for home builders. And on new markets tax credits, you know what they mean. I mean, they're all over Worcester and Springfield. Without those projects, without those tax credits, the projects don't get built.
That's right.
So I knew they were very popular. I would say to you folks, take your member of Congress to see the work.
That's right.
So you can connect them to the actual work that's being done. So Tom gave the dutiful answer. They've been eliminated, Mr. Neal. And of course, it gave me the opportunity to say, I can't believe that we're eliminating these tax credits that are as popular with the American people. 2 weeks later, I don't know how they did it, they put it back in. By the way, after they passed the law, they put it back in. So I said to Brady, I said, hey, that was a pretty good piece of work. He said, I'm saving that for a memoir. Because I know what happened when he went back to his Republican colleagues. He said, what are you thinking of getting rid of that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Bill well knows some stories about walking down to someone else's office and trying to communicate and try to get things done. One final question. Looking ahead in this session, what do you expect to be on the agenda?
Well, I think once you get past the final phase of the tax credits, which I think there will be movement, then you get to the re-elect cycle.
Yeah.
And with redistricting, a lot of this becomes more challenging. I do think that up until the last few years that Congress used to be able to do big things in election years. Not anymore. Not anymore. I think it's just harder now because people stake out positions and they can't walk away from them because they think you're somehow softening or you're caving in. And I think the challenges are coming to conservatives from the right and to Democrats from the left, liberal Democrats from the left. And I look at it now, and it's worrisome to me because I think that it means it's harder to get other things and bigger things done afterwards. Nancy Pelosi, as I noted earlier, she was very strategic, she was polarizing for sure. And, she was a very good symbol for the other side to rally against. They always said she was a San Francisco liberal. And I used to say, no, she was from Baltimore. It's like Springfield and Boston, sharp elbows. But she would stake out a position and then she'd find an opportunity to get it done. You know what I mean? You meet people that are very good at making speeches. But then you find people that patiently sit in a room and you get an answer. And she was one of them. Recently, President Trump said that he was president and speaker of the House. Can you imagine Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, or Joe Biden saying that about Nancy Pelosi? She tells this very funny story, again, about legislating, standing up to your own side when you think they're wrong. Standing up to your own side. A lot of people in the White House, when she did the ACA, they were against going forward on it. And she said, no, we're going to do it. And But she told me this funny story. She said she called the White House to say she was going to Taiwan. Remember, that was very controversial when she went to Taiwan. And I'm not going to give you the name of the person at the White House president's staff. Oh, that's great, he said, Madam Speaker, we'll call the State Department. I said to him, I didn't call to ask if I could go to Taiwan. I called to tell you I was going to Taiwan. And she said, I hung up. And again, it's this notion that somehow you're obedient to a president when you're in Congress. It's not true, even if it's of your own party. If you think they're wrong, you got to say so. I mean, I disagree with Bill Clinton. I disagree with Barack Obama. I disagree with Joe Biden. I also thought they were pretty good presidents. And I think that the problem you have now is that people are afraid on the other side to challenge the president. And that would play out in both midterm elections.
Well, Congressman Neal, I had the chance to interact with your colleagues, past and present, quite a bit, and others in Washington, D.C., and I can say that each time I bring up the name Richard Neal, there's nothing but respect that I hear back down in Washington. So we're proud of the work you do. We're thankful for the work you've done over many years, and we thank you for joining us here today.
I do love the history of the lore of, you know, how you make the deal, you're sitting in a room, and Mr. Rostenkowski was not big on dissent. He used to have a great mind. He'd try to get your vote, he'd stay with you. And most members of Congress are pretty savvy. You stay at it, try to get a little more, try to get a little more, I need this and I need that. And a lot of them don't get that part of it anymore either. And Rostenkowski used to say, I told you, I'd stay with you until the end. It's the end.